All right, I got it.
Show.
Thanks, guys. All right, so let's call this meeting to order, 6:05 L&A. Today's one and only agenda item is blight. And I know there's been quite a bit of work done by various people prior to this meeting, actually for years. And we want to put some control and around the process for blight, potentially some of the definition. I felt that this meeting was in order with some of the, good people from town hall who are working in and around the blight topic, whether they're executing blight ordinance or, they're hearing from townspeople what their feeling blight is. But here in L&A, we want to start this conversation. Should say continue this conversation to put some markers on the definition of blight potentially, and certainly the execution around similar types of services in town, like in planning and zoning and inland wetlands, around some of the administrative pieces they have there. So hopefully that kind of jives with what everybody's thinking. And I felt maybe a good place to start was going to be, I think, Mr. Alito, you had some work that I know you were working on over the last couple of months. And I had shared your email around this was more of the administrative side of blight, which I think was the right start. And John, Jason, do you think it's a good place for Mr. Alito to kind of just give us an overlay of that, and or do you guys have anything to add before we start with Mr. Alito?
For me, no, certainly I think that's the best place to start. Thank you so much for those red lines and that work that you've done. I didn't have a chance to review it, and I'm really happy with how this is coming along. So I look forward to hearing what you have to say, and for us to be able to get everything into place for this.
Sounds good. Jonathan, anything from you before?
No.
All right, good. All right, so Frank, is that a good place?
That's fine. I'll just go over it quickly because I did send the red line around, so I presume everybody read it and understands the changes were all mostly, I shouldn't say all, were mostly discussed either specifically or in spirit at the last meeting we had. So just taking from the top, statutory definitions, inclusions, and clarity as to the establishment and purpose. I won't waste our time with going over that. I did, when we got to definitions, I left them highlighted because it certainly was agreed upon that we would discuss that at a later time. So my highlights are doing nothing other than to indicate that section is going to be changed for sure. I didn't touch it. We did discuss getting rid of the abandoned definition. So I just deleted that. I took liberty to do that because I think there was unanimous consent on that. We made changes to special considerations as discussed. So again, I made those red lines, cleaned it up a little bit, made it much more pointed and direct. So again, I don't think we have to get into that, but basically, if there is a feeling amongst the powers that be that due to disability, being elderly, active military, or that the person that is residing in the residence subject to blight is not capable of performing remedial measures, that special considerations can be taken into account, which was certainly what our unanimous decision was last time.
Yep.
We cleaned up the definitions as to who the selectman may designate and as a anti-blight enforcement officer and that person's authority, which is pursuant to this article. And we also authorized the selectmen to appoint other staff as appropriate and necessary to help with investigations or enforcement. Section B, we just authorized the anti-blight enforcement officer to issue citations, and that the citation would identify specifically the anti-blight ordinance violated and provide that the responsible party is subject to additional fines. The reason why we have that language is I personally don't think it's necessary, but we would probably be in the minority amongst jurisdictions or municipalities if we didn't include specific statutory reference to the state statute. Ken was of the opinion, as I guess I am also of the opinion, that the more notice we give to individuals who are subject to a blight citation, that they could be subject to additional fines by the state of Connecticut in addition to the municipality, is appropriate and couldn't hurt. So I did include reference to it, although the statute speaks for itself. We talked about fine and payment. We talked about the limitation on $100 per day as the maximum fine statutorily. So I did recite that. I fixed the citation regarding the statutory reference, the 7-148 sub C sub there, as may be amended, so we don't have to keep going back and changing it, as our old ordinances didn't do well, and the new ones are doing a good job of this. We talked about the collection of attorney's fees and all costs of litigation. There's been some new case law on the definition of law, says that they relate to collection actions in court. So when you see costs of litigation, it's a new phrase that allows a party to a lawsuit to collect any and all costs that would be associated with litigation, such as expert fees, it used to be just costs of suit. So there's been a lot of litigation recently defining and interpreting cost as meaning a lot less than what us as attorneys intended it to be. Someone must have messed up as one of our colleagues, so they probably fixed that for them. So that's why it says cost of litigation, just to make sure that we can collect all expenses that are incurred. Change multiple days to more than one day, just to clarify that. We gave more authority during the hearing procedure paragraph, which is 405.14, so the officer can reduce or eliminate fines as determined appropriately in good faith and all that other stuff. And that would be if, again, as we talked about last time, the goal is compliance, not penalization necessary. So that would give some authorization to the hearing officer to, if by the time the hearing rolls around, they've come into compliance and they've remediated the blighted premises, then we can reduce fines as appropriate. We talked about at length, we talked about who would be appropriately disqualified or appropriate to serve as a hearing officer. So I clarified that in 405.15. You have to be a citizen of the town, not an employee of the town, and not appointed or elected. I didn't do it in that exact way. It was kind of in the reverse, but that's what it meant. And then we talked about the lien on real estate. So we put that lien provision in there so that we could, again, it's statutory, not necessary to recite it, but Ken and I thought that it would be appropriate, again, to make sure that everybody was on notice that this is a repercussion should you not come into compliance, that it's a serious matter and it could constitute a lien. And lastly, and most importantly, we talked about the ability to have staff enter upon the real estate for remediation. That'll allow us, if we think that there is a prevailing circumstance that is emergent or otherwise requires the town to enter upon the property to either perform remediation or inspect. We would have the authority to do that. Again, statutorily, we do have the authority to do that. We wanted to make it express, and there is some case law that I found that says if it's not specific in the ordinance, then it's questionable whether or not there was enough notice for that authority. So we wanted to be express about that and put that in as well. I was asked a question by Mr. Kellogg, I think from, maybe it was Mr. Maurer or someone here. I don't remember specifically who, but do we have the authority to enter upon property to perform certain remedial measures and collect for that? If we have to board up a home, I think I was asked if we had to knock down a home, could we do such a thing? And the answer is yes. But obviously that would be an absolute last case, last ditch scenario. We're not Bridgeport, we are Monroe. So I can't imagine that would come to that. But I know we've had cases in the past where when I was on council, whenever there was a house Far Horizon or something like that, I think it was, that was subject to a fire, and then there was a foreclosure, and there was all kinds of battles over who had the ownership rights and the obligations. And so there was a lot of talk of this. So, and again, I talked to Ken, I think we would really look hard at this statute, and if this was the vehicle we would use, I would probably recommend some type of separate action where we'd seek injunctive relief and really get some legitimate upfront judicial authority to do something of that magnitude. I would certainly, we'd come to council if it was me or somebody else, but I would recommend that course of action if we're going to do something extraordinary like that in a town like Monroe.
Frank, can I just ask a quick question on that one, just
Sure.
for my own mind? So yeah, so I'm the way I'm in, you're saying it correct. You're saying it fine. I just want to make sure I understand it.
Yeah.
So the way I interpret that is it would no longer be really the blight administrative executive sort of ordinance. We would take it sort of almost extrapolate it out of that and seek some other judicial or process within the state or town to execute on something like that. It wouldn't be explicitly listed in blight. Is that,
You know,
have that right or no?
I think that's a multi-part question, but I think to answer the end of the question, it wouldn't explicitly need to be stated in this ordinance, but we would have the authority pursuant to this ordinance if we wanted to do something that extreme. My personal recommendation, again, it depends on the situation, but personally, and I said, I'm on the record of saying this, so you can pull up one of the 700 times I said it on the council minutes, is I think without a blight ordinance, we still have that ability to legal authority to proceed. There are other avenues that we could go down in order to do that. So again, if we were going to knock someone's house down, I can't imagine that happening. If we had to do that, I don't know that I would rely on our blight statute and say, hey, let's give it a shot. It's the first time we ever done it in Monroe in 100 years. Let's just do what our brothers and sisters in Bridgeport do. I told you a story in Bridgeport. I represented a guy. He literally bought a house. He went to Turkey. Okay, he bought a house. He pulled a building permit. It was a 4 families. He pulled a building permit to rehab the place. He had a family emergency. He went to Turkey for a month. He came home and the house was gone. No joke. He called me up. He's like, my house is gone. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like it's like the Wizard of Oz, like a tornado came? Like, what are you talking about? He's like, no, it's gone. So he took a picture, sent it to me. We went to the city hall and they literally, through their anti-blight ordinance, knocked down the guy's property because they had cited the previous owner numerous times. But the problem that they had was ownership changed hands. And he was in town hall pulling permits and he was given permits. And the same town hall knocked his property down, which is not shocking, but that's the kind of stuff that you don't, so you don't want to rely on this simple, ordinance that you have in your charter or your code to do something that extreme. So, but I think we're good here. I mean, honestly, I think this is pretty solid the way it is. And keep in mind, I stayed within our statutory mechanism or statutory framework that we have, or ordinance framework that we have for zoning, and the same framework we have for inland wetlands. So if it was up to me, I'd love to expand the definitions and kind of do a lot more with all of those ordinances. But since it's taken us 15 years to get to this point, I figured we would kind of move that forward, streamlined.
Well, one thing I would mention about that, about the demo you were just talking about, you'd have health and building involved in that right from the get up.
Correct.
It wouldn't even, no blood officer in his mind would say, oh, look.
Well, that's.
But maybe
Depends on what time
not
you're
either.
No, but I agree with Joe. Joe's right. So that's what I mean. So when I was asked that question, the answer is yes, we could do it. But why would we do it through this vehicle?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where I'm going. It wouldn't make sense to. So I'm also coming from the angle here. We're here to talk about a document, right? And what goes into it. So I'm just curious where things like that would be. And it sounds like they would not necessarily in totality reside in this document. That's not where those conditions are sort of like almost like measurements would be. So that's good. I'm glad.
Yeah, I mean, look at this ordinance allows us to literally enter upon property to inspect, to secure a piece of loose siding or knock a home down. That would be the extremes that we could do, all pursuant to this ordinance, in my professional opinion. So.
Yeah, and on the administrative side, we're providing, our citizens with the ability to participate in this, make sure they understand it. They have a say, like we just can't roll when someone goes to, Michigan for the month and then just roll in without.
And I'll tell you this, I mean, and Joe can tell you too, but Joe was involved at some point with giving an opinion as to his feeling on enforcement of anti-blight. And one of the reasons why we felt this would be overly burdensome years ago was at that time, Joe was inundated with pages and pages and pages of violations that he wasn't even able to get to. We had some serious violations that he really wanted to work on. And I'm not speaking for him, but I remember him sitting in this room saying, I got 150 violations that I have to go and check every day. We have some egregious ones that are really detrimental to the town, and we have other ones. And now we're going to add all this subjective stuff on. We just didn't have the manpower to do it at that time. And it really, based upon the however you want to look at it, but the ambiguous nature of how you move forward. At the time, we didn't think it was really something that we wanted to burden the town with. But with that being said, it's not a bad thing if we can come up with proper definitions. And in that regard, just as a segue, if no one has any, I mean, maybe I'll stop if anybody has any questions about anything I said. No? Okay, so as a segue, I think it's important to understand a couple of things about, before we get into definitions, is we struggled mightily with over defining certain situations. And then we also struggled with being too ambiguous. There's the challenge here is the balancing act between subjectivity and objectivity, because, it's important that we establish a line, albeit maybe it's slightly gray, but there needs to be a line between what the legislative authority does and what the executive branch has as far as input on the definitions. I don't want, as the town attorney, I really don't want there to be too much influence, undue or otherwise, from the executive branch here, and that would include, Mr. Kellogg's office and Mr. Schultz and Mr. Chapman. Certainly, they can give you their perspective, but I don't know that we want to get too much into, what do you want to see as a definition? I really think that should be up to the lawmakers, and that's you guys. So we can certainly be suggestive, but I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. I'm hoping that there's not going to be, what do you, Mr. Kellogg, what do you want to see? Mr. Chapman, what do you want to see? Mr. Schultz, what do you want to see? Because I don't know that we want to go there right now. They can certainly have an opinion on what's suggested, but I don't know if they want to establish what their definition of blight would be, first off. Second off is keep in mind that we don't want the enforcement to be so difficult from an interpretation standpoint that Mr. Chapman's subjective opinion is different than Mr. Reed's subjective opinion, which is different than Mr. Schultz's subjective opinion, and different than the complaining neighbor's subjective opinion. So I think it's good to be ambiguous and kind of general, but it's also, we got to give some strict guidance to the town hall, so that when we're enforcing this, it's not looked at as discriminatory or unfair or something like that. So there's the 15-year challenge. So good luck. That's really all I had. But like I said, if you look at Ansonia, I keep going back to that example because I'm still shocked by it. If you're missing a piece of siding, it's blight. If you're missing I think if you're missing like a picket on your fence, it's blight. To Southbury or Middlebury or one of them, where it was really, they focused on, they must have a problem with storage of boats and vehicles and cars or something like that, because that seemed to be a focus. And, I know we have that in our zoning regs anyway, so I don't know if we need to focus on that, but they had a focus on that. And then they really were really general because of I talked to the attorney at the time. Again, this is going back like 8 or 10 years. And they really were trying to preserve the rural integrity of their community and didn't want to get too much into infringing on property rights and telling people what color their homes could be and stuff like that. So those are two extreme examples we used 100 years ago. It's still like that a little bit, but I think what you'll see more common is, like, I go to Westport a lot. I think they did a really good job in Westport with their definitions. I think I have that here. I can read it to you if you want. But again, it still gets into some deep detail. They talk about dilapidation, and then they described it as dilapidated or becoming dilapidated as documented by the building official, which is interesting. Attracting illegal activity as documented by the police department. And this is funny because this came out after we had discussed it, but this is exactly where we were going. We were going with kind of going through the departments and saying, if the departments have a real issue with it pursuant to their regulations and their definitions, zoning and the wetlands, we don't really have to go to the wetlands, but, zone building, police, fire, health. So this says dilapidation is a fire hazard as determined by the fire marshal or as documented by the fire department. They have a blight prevention board, so similar So if it's determined by the board or building official or director of health that the condition of the building, structure, or parcel of land poses a serious or immediate danger to the safety, health, or general welfare. So we were talking about that in the context of fire, police, health, and forget about the board. And I think that's kind of, honestly, it's superfluous. It's saying the same thing as what it said above. And then they went into failure to adequately maintain and the factors that may be considered, which I liked because it's not like Ansonia, which is like, this is dilapidation. They suggested things like multiple missing, broken, or boarded windows or doors, collapsing or missing walls, roofs, or floors, seriously damaged or missing siding, which I think is weird, a structurally faulty foundation, which could probably be an issue in and of itself, excessive amounts of garbage or trash. Again, good luck with that. Back to the abandoned motor vehicles not registered with the commissioner pursuant to CGS, including cars, trucks, boats, motorcycles, or other inoperable machinery on the premises visible from the street or any adjoining property, rodent harborage or infestation, unrepaired fire or water damage, and parking lots left in a state of disrepair or abandonment, so that was their definitions of blight. And then dilapidation was defined as any building or structure or part thereof which is deemed as unsafe or which is designated as unfit for human habitation by the building official. So I thought they did a pretty good job, honestly. I think that's pretty close to where we were at years ago. And like I said, ironically, this came out well after that. This came out in 14, so it's probably right around the same time. But I know we didn't look at it, and I know I looked for it.
Right.
The other one I pulled, I don't know where this is from. It's all pulled apart. This one goes into more detail, talks about, dead trees, stagnant or unsanitary water, broken exterior lights or display lights, paint chipped or faded. Could you imagine? I mean, faded paint on your house is blight. I mean, that's insanity. My personal opinion. Sorry, I'm not speaking as an attorney right now. Clothes left hanging from trees. Shrubs or
You
fences.
gotta wonder where that one happened, and then they had to add it.
Yeah, left, like for how long, doesn't say. Interior furniture left outside. Maybe like, is that can't have a couch outside? Maybe I like my couch. I don't know. It's got a water, maybe I put some of that waterproof stuff on you, put on your suede boots.
Frank, is there a way to, obviously at the beginning of the call, we went through the structure and sort of the execution and administrative aspects of it.
Yeah.
But is there to me, I think all that's really left is definition of blight, right? Which
Right, yeah, I agree.
To act. So is there a way, all of these examples, almost all of them are, it doesn't even matter if they're crazy or not. They're very specific, right? If it's written, then the policy is going to have to be, processed. So is there a way in sort of ordinance writing and legal writing to give an indication of what blight could be without specifically saying it is, in order for a complaint to happen and be sort of legitimate? And then for the, the citizen who is being accused of it or is subjected to it, to be able to contest it. But do we have to be this specific? I'd like to start with just more the principle of the writing as opposed to specifics and content.
Well, I think that's where we are. We're at the definition phase. So it's, yes, you have to be specific. The question is, well, you have to be specific with what the definition is. That specificity may be more general than.
That's where I'm going. So is there a way? Obviously, you want explicit language that's specific. What I'm saying is, do we need to say shirts hanging from trees?
No, you don't need to say that. Here's where we were. And again, it's really close to what I just said, is if the building official deems the property to be dilapidated, fire department, police, health. That's where we were. So we agreed. And the concern there is, I'll stop, is okay, suppose you have an overzealous town employee. Suppose, Nancy, because she's not here. We'll rather talk about Nancy because she's not here. Nancy, thinks that one rat running through, someone saw two rats on two different occasions running through someone's yard. That's a vermin infestation. And she thinks that's a problem and she shuts it down. The question then is, okay, we have to dig deeper unless you have the authority to do it. Where does it say that? Is it in our code? So, the naysayers, and I'm saying I don't agree with that. The naysayers would say, well, we believe in our town hall employees. They're supervised by the first selectman's office to the extent that he has authority to do that. And otherwise they're governed by statute or our regulations as they are. So they already are in place. So if they're violating them pursuant to some legislative authority, whether it be local or state or federal, if it applies, then that's enough. And and then they're gonna have additional teeth. Those department heads will have additional teeth of enforcement through this ordinance. So I think everybody agreed that was fine. So building, police, fire. I think we have an interesting situation with fire because we talk about fire marshal, fire departments are volunteer here. So we probably wouldn't want to include that in this town. So we're probably talking about
Fire
fire marshal.
Yeah.
Talking about health, building, okay, police, fine. And then it's everything else. It's the kitchen sink. So what else is not, and again, I would defer to Joe and Rick on this because, they would have to tell you, this is not considered to be a zoning violation, or you have to talk to the building official. This is not a building.
Right.
Let me put it this way. These things are a concern to L&A or town council. Are they already addressed in zoning building? And if they're not, that's where you get this list. And again, I would suggest, I think we should copy language, not copy it, but have language that says that these factors could be considered, but are not absolutes unless you have an absolute. So, how do you feel about fences and things like that, walls and roofs and floors? And a lot of this is going to be duplicative, right? I mean, I'm assuming if a building official knows that there's a missing wall and half a foundation sinking in, that's going to be some type of potential issue where it's deemed uninhabitable or unsafe. But you got to be careful there. I've had cases like this. Like I've had a lot of municipal cases where I had one in Easton not too long ago, and it was a fire, and the building official deemed the property they basically deemed it uninhabitable and issued a cease and desist and a notice on the door. And we sued and we fought it. And we said, what the guy did was he hired a structural engineer, came out and turned like the garage area into a little living space. And he secured that portion of the home and it disregarded the rest. And we just stayed there and we just lived there and said, what you got to do? And we went to court. I think it settled out of court. I don't think we ever had a judicial opinion, but basically they backed off and just said, you know what, structurally sound, there's nothing we can do. It's meets code. The building official went in there and made them hook up a couple things and that's it. So, again, but I think the lesson is it took care of itself internally. So long as there was compliance with what the town wanted, it was okay. So, and again, I put the onus, if you think about that example, put the onus on the violated person to provide the town with enough opinion that kind of allowed the town to back off a little bit without the town being liable, because it was a liability issue. If the town allowed someone to live there and something, God forbid, happened, it would have been a problem. So I think if you agree with what I said with the departmental authority, call it, you're down to what else do you care about? That's not covered.
Yeah. So if I were able to kind of brief you back on what I'm hearing, it's if the dwelling and or the land is deemed dilapidated in a dilapidated state by police, fire marshal, health department, whoever we decide, the following process is enacted. And that's all it needs to say to define blight. Like we don't have to say what dilapidated means.
We do need to say, we'd have to find dilapidated because it's not defined. But we don't have to use, we don't have to have a double definition. We can skip dilapidation and we can just say a violation of the regulations or ordinances that, I'm being general, but basically the town health regulations and ordinance, the zoning regulations are, so we could skip dilapidation. But I think if you dilapidation as they had it defined was any building or structure which is deemed unsafe or unfit for human, unfit for human habitation by the building official.
Yeah, that's already defined. That's already executable there. So therefore, the blight ordinance would refer to.
Yeah, and then so they went, and so what they did was they did it so it had to be dilapidated as a threshold and doing something else,
Okay,
which actually makes no sense whatsoever if you think about it, because
it's
the
almost
first,
circular.
if it's dilapidated, it was enough. So if
Yeah.
it's dilapidated and something else, it's just plus. Like, I don't know if it goes up on the list or whatever. So I don't necessarily think we should follow that structure.
No, I think there's some things that we might have to list out when we define it. I guess what I would like to see in the ordinance for the definition of blight is really focusing on violations of our code, either zoning, building, health, whatever it is, fire marshal.
Yeah.
Whatever it is with that, along with any endangering public health and public safety and health. So that's really all I really want to go down, because I don't think, we don't want anybody to go out to their neighbor with a ruler saying your grass is an inch too long. That's the problem. I think the blight, the most important part of it is to promote public health and prevent people from getting sick or harmed on the property. So that's what I would like to go. I don't really have a problem with the general structure of Westport's. I agree with the town attorney that I don't think we need both sections where we can just define blight in that way without having to have that extra the addition to make it a blighted property, and just define a blighted property involving public health and safety. That's where I'm at. I don't know if my fellow members of the subcommittee agree, but I would also say that for the process, I'm comfortable moving that to another meeting where we can have public input after we reach a decision on definitions.
Yeah, I agree with most of that. The one thing that we have to be careful of is we can't just define it as a violation of zoning regulations or things along those lines, as some of those regulations would have nothing to do with blight. Things such as your property is completely enclosed with trees, but you built a shed too close to your neighbor's property line. Nobody can see it from the street or from the property line. There's no blighted aspect to it. It's perfectly safe. It's perfectly well built. It's still a zoning regulation, but that wouldn't, to me, be under the definition of blight and would be handled statutorily. Before I get into definitions, there were two items non-definition related that I wanted to get people's feelings towards. The first is in the appointments. Is there a way, or should we have, that the appointments of both the anti-blight enforcement officer and of the hearing officers, that the first selectman shall have the ability to appoint all well and good, and then have a sentence in there that any such appointment shall be reported to the town council or to somebody, basically to a body on the public record, but I would assume the town council would be the proper one, by the first selectman, just as a way of keeping track in the public of who those people are and having a public notice of that and of some sort.
Frank, how does he report that? Elizabeth Edgerton, I think, does the zoning appeals?
In the past, he's reported it as part of his update to town council. And I can tell you why I wouldn't agree with that, Jason, and I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I don't know if that's proper to be putting in our municipal ordinances. And I don't know that we want to start with anti-blight when it's not in the wetlands or zoning. And again, these mirror each other. So that's the only suggestion I would make. It just, again, I did my best to try to keep them as uniform as possible from an enforcement standpoint. The other thing, while I have a chance, is, we keep mentioning zoning. Zoning would be excluded from any definition of anti-blight because it has its own enforcement process. So in the wetlands and zoning are their own animals. So it should just be building, health, fire, police. I wouldn't recommend zoning.
My one concern is having a way to guarantee that under this ordinance, the public knows who they're supposed to be contacting.
Well,
Wouldn't that be on the website?
I mean, it'd certainly be on the website, but why would a member of the public have to contact anybody?
Well, if they want to report a blight violation. That goes to my next point, which is that we don't have necessarily a reason for a blight officer to, within this, for the blight enforcement officer to respond to a specific property. And that should this contain something basically stating that a blight enforcement officer shall make a determination based off of any complaint by a member of the public or based on a directive of the first selectman.
Well, I would defer to Joe and ask him what his process is now.
Typically, I'll get either a phone call or an email, or something might come through Q alert as to a complaint. Typically, at this point, through Q alert, which is fine. Secondary, I usually get a phone call, and then third, in order of how I get them, is usually an email. So if it comes through Q alert, then we follow through the process of, I go out and send run out, whatever we need to do on the follow this up. And sometimes it's pretty obvious as to where the responsibility would actually be. If it's clearly a zoning issue, you mentioned before a shed, well, that's a zoning violation. There's nothing to do with blight.
Right.
That's that. If it turns out that somebody's got a dozen junk cars behind a fence that you can't see from a public way, that becomes a different situation, because there that specifically says if you can't see it, it's not an issue.
Right.
Well, whether it's an issue or not is kind of not up to me to determine that, because if it says in there it's not an issue, then it's not an issue. So my response to the person is, I drove by, I can't see any cars there. What's the complaint? So it's kind of a balancing act there. We know it's there, but we really can't do anything about it according to that. Is it a violation of something else? Now, something like that, unregistered vehicles, is a zoning violation already. But I've got to be able to see them. So how do you do that? Do we send the drone up? Do I, I mean, there's ways to do things, like go to the neighbor's house to complain, go to the second floor and look out his window, and there it is. That, okay, if that works, then yes, but I just want everybody to be clear about, you write things in here that, boats, motorhomes, they're all over the place. Everybody knows it. Honestly, do I ever chase boats and motorhomes? Not unless they really publish, or a safety issue, because first of all, it's foolish to be trying to do that. Everybody's got them. They disappear when the warm weather gets here, and the problem sort of solves itself. So if somebody's got a complaint about they're parking their motorhome in the front yard, well, if it's a registered vehicle, then from a practical standpoint, okay, that's what they're doing. If they're allowed to park the thing in the front yard, okay. I think there could be some changes to some of the zoning regs concerning that, which Rick and I have been looking at, and I think we'll be adjusting those things, but blight in some ways kind of covers the things that everybody else doesn't.
Correct.
Yeah.
Agreed.
And that's where my sort of principal questions from, which is, we look at everything that health and zoning and fire marshal and police are doing. Blight is the catch-all, right? Or it seems to be, at least philosophically. How then do we define blight? Because the second we say a t-shirt's hanging from a tree,
right,
we've now defined explicitly and specifically blight. Therefore, everything must be defined. So I just don't know what that magical mixture is.
Before we even get to definitions, though, my question is, what causes the zoning enforcement officer to look at a specific property, at a specific issue, as per what is set forth in these definitions? My personal opinion is that at the beginning of section 405-10B, we just add something very simple, basically saying, upon the direction of the first selectman or the complaint of any citizen or business owner of Monroe, the anti-blight enforcement officer officers are authorized to issue citations. They still are fully in determination, but it gives a reason for them to be going out. Because my
Jason,
guess,
here's the problem with that. I mean, if there's a million different ways in which a potential violation of blight in this case would come to the attention of the blight officer. It could be from a fellow member of town hall doing some other service, right? So, I mean, that's how you have someone out looking at building officials looking at a new addition or a new home, and they see some man-made, someone digging a pond in the backyard. That's a different department, but that's how it would come to the attention of inland wetlands, and I can name a million examples such as that. So I don't know. And the other concern I have with that is we don't want to compel the enforcement officer to investigate every single complaint. Because I can tell you, if you start doing that and you have to, I mean, it's going to be 5 million complaints and you're like, yeah, I'll get to it in 2097. Like, it's just not going to ever happen. So the anti-blight enforcement officer, this takes us full circle because we talked about this with zoning enforcement. It's like, okay, who is the zoning enforcement officer reporting to and who has the authority to determine what is most harmful to the town priority? It's a difficult question. It's an interesting question. I mean, some would say the commission. That's probably right. Some would say the town planner. I think as a whole, it's got to be my personal opinion, it's got to be a kind of a joint effort to prioritize that.
My concern is that it's a catch-22 in that as it's currently written, the blight enforcement officer isn't compelled to check out anything. They have the authority to issue citations, but they are not compelled to check out anything.
Well, guess what? Then they're gonna get replaced by the first selectman.
No, that's fair.
Yeah, I mean,
That's fair.
it is discretionary, and I think you really have to, I mean, if everyone agrees that the person who's doing that job is suitable for that job based on their history or whatever it might happen to be, then clearly you hire the right people to do a job and you rely on their expertise in order to follow through on that. I certainly get complaints that I know, there's absolutely nothing I can do about it because it's totally beyond my ability or anybody's ability here to do anything about it. But second of all, I know it's going to resolve itself in a month anyway, and possibly the person who's complaining is a chronic complainer who complains about anything. So you're right, there is nothing in that says I have to go look at it, but you've got to be able to say to somebody here at town hall, yes, we want you to take a look at it, but if they say back, look, it's a done deal, forget about it. Then you have to be able to say that, yes, we've already taken care of it. Or I'll go take a look at it, they make a determination, there's nothing there to chase after, we're done with it.
That makes sense.
You're right. There's nothing in there that says I have to go look at it, but if you want to do your job correctly, yes. Then you give it a quick look and see if there's anything on it and you move on.
And that takes us full circle too. Could you imagine if the definition of blight was a missing piece of siding? And could you imagine
that's where I'm going. Like, it's just like, what's that magic?
Could you imagine if Joe was compelled to issue a citation? They're like, oh, Mr. Chapman, you're not doing your job because my neighbor's got a missing piece of siding. And clearly
exactly. On one side, you've got like these very specific draconian measures of blight. And on the other side, you have a zoning enforcement officer or anybody else the first selectman deems can go out and look compelled, not Jason, not that I'm challenging what you're saying, but compelled to go out and investigate it. It's a double whammy. I mean, we will get ourselves in such a jam in our city. And again,
no, that makes sense.
The checkpoint, right? The checkpoint is very simple. 13,500 citizens of this town have an absolute right and an obligation to vote for the first selectman. If they don't like what he or she is doing, they'll vote him out. The next person will come in and fire the CEO.
Right.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is that you also, you other point I do count is that one of the things about, who's enforcing this.
Yeah.
We're trying to make an effort to not have an overzealous CEO that does look for how high each blade of grass is. On the other hand, you also want to be in a position where, for some reason, the first selectman or somebody else in authority say, I want you to chase this guy, this guy, and this guy.
Yeah.
That doesn't play very well either.
Correct.
No.
So,
can I make a suggestion for going through what we currently have as definitions of blighted premises and say, just as a committee, do we think that should remain within the definition or not? And that way we can kind of put things in or knock things out from based off of what we have already?
My opinion on just like my opinion, I mean, again, I think that's a good process to take for most things. But I'm actually I'm extrapolating it to a higher level. I want to have a principled conversation. Do we want any specifics of blight?
I think you have to.
Or we don't, because the second you have one, you have to have all of them, because then you become explicit and not, right? So it's if you say a t-shirt hanging in a tree is blight, then everything that you define as blight must be in that ordinance.
See, I think you and I are saying specific differently, and that I don't think we should be that specific. No, I think we need to be more general than that. But I do think we need to say more than just the extreme generalization of anything that is dilapidated at the consideration of the blight enforcement officer.
So
Like,
what's the happy medium then? Like, I mean,
Well, and
I'm
that's why
asking
I
if
wanted
I'm
to
clueless.
go through, because we actually have some happy mediums in here, in my opinion.
Sure.
Like, so we have one, it is in a condition which poses an egregious or serious threat to the safety, health, and general welfare of the community as determined by, and then we replace this by the blight enforcement officer, defined term.
So wouldn't the health the health department would have that under theirs already, right?
Well, so my view on this in certain aspects is that it would be the final determination would be the blight enforcement officer. And the blight enforcement officer here has the ability to bring in other staff members. So if it's a possible health issue, I think it would be the job of the blight enforcement officer to go to the director of health and say, hey, I think this is in violation. What do you think? The director of health says, I think you're right. And then the blight enforcement officer can make that determination. And that's kind of my view on it with things along those lines. I don't know other people's thoughts, but that's why I would leave it in the hands of the blight enforcement officer.
I wonder if I could interject something on that. I think one thing to remember too is the zoning officer goes and makes the determination, this is blight. It goes through the citation process. The hearing officer then reviews this entire situation from both sides. The hearing officer is going to make a decision, I'm using me, make the decision correctly. If she determines based on the evidence that I didn't, I'm overruled, problem solved. So there is an automatic backup in the system. You just can't go willy-nilly issuing citations to everybody, because you know somebody's going to be reviewing this. That's why we have the hearing officer for zoning.
Completely agree.
Agreed.
And just so you all know, the highlighted definitions are not the definitions that exist in our current statute.
Okay.
Just so you know, that those are like hybrids that when we last left off with this body, we were getting more comfortable with more generalization. If you look at our actual blighted premises definitions, they're 1 through 12.
Right.
So
right.
I was going to say, I
Jason,
kind of like this highlighted definition for the most part.
Because I actually thought, Jason, you meant our blight ordinance, and I'm like, I don't agree with anything in there. Because
I meant these highlighted
all right,
definitions.
so we were
that are in
conflating
here.
two things. Okay, good. Okay.
For the most part, I like that definition. And my one thing that I would say is to put disrepair and dilapidations definition within that, because I don't think anywhere in a blighted, unless I'm missing it, nothing is defined as disrepair or dilapidation within what is considered blighted.
It's number 2.
Number 2.
But it doesn't, we didn't get to the point where we use number 2 to.
No, that's what I'm saying is number 2
Yeah.
should be part of number 1.
Yeah, that's where it was going, to be honest with you. We
Okay.
just never got there.
All right, perfect. Then I think those are pretty good definitions. I don't know if there's things anybody thinks we're missing, or if there's things that are in those highlights that people think shouldn't be in there. But in my opinion, I like those definitions. I think they are specific enough that it gives the blight enforcement officer a direction as to what they should be looking for and authority, but not so specific that somebody can say, well, you defined shirt in tree as blight, And here we have shirt on banister, and that's not a tree, so therefore that's not blight. That it doesn't get into that. And also, I don't think it opens it up for ridiculous things like that. I don't think anything along those lines that we are trying to avoid. Your grass is a little bit too long, you're missing a piece of siding or faded paint fits any of those definitions. And those were things that we wanted to avoid.
Well, one thing I might mention about, you bring up, we've been talking about things like, the shirt on the tree. I think we've got a situation right now, not too far from here, where the gentleman who's been working on an addition on his house has got a pile of pallets, debris, scrap lumber, tree trunks, branches, et cetera, literally the size of this room in the backyard, backing up to the neighbor's property. They got their in-ground pool and their gazebo and their manicured lawn, and they're looking right at this. Well, I'd have to say that's a situation, it's not really covered under anything from zoning. And there's no
Well, it is
wetland.
covered here in the definitions we put here. In
Right, so-
that it's saying that that's not allowed unless it's there for a period of not to exceed 6 months, as may be reasonably related to the repair or restoration. And we can do of more than just equipment there. We could also do of property or equipment.
So if things like that are covered, then we're covered.
See, I don't know if I don't think that would be covered there.
I agree, as it's written, it's not, but I think we can formulate that exception into a more general, not just for the boats and cars and stuff, and do it for repair of property as well, repair or improvement of property with a very similar definition.
The issues that we discussed, again, I'm giving you historical facts, were accumulation of unregistered motor vehicles, ATVs, tractors, garbage, antiques, alleged artwork, whatever you want to call boats, RVs, all that kind of stuff. That was one area of concern. The other area of concern was exactly what Joe was talking about, is kind of undefined collection of building debris, call it, or property that is not harboring vermin, is not otherwise inappropriate. So how do you deal with that? Garbage and trash collection is another one that was concerning, and then kind of called the general, what we just talked about, the general unsafe condition type of situation that exists with structures or outbuildings. So the one thing I like about Westport, just so you know, is and this is where we're at, right? You're giving the zoning are you going to give the zoning enforcement officer the discretion to determine whether it is a serious threat to safety, health, or welfare? And in our case, it says egregious or serious. And now you're adding additional defining arbitrary terms to the definition. Or you're going to do it what we talked about with West. I don't even know if it is Westport, but it's one of these other towns where they say as determined by the police department, as determined by the fire marshal, as determined by the building official. So who are you giving the discretion to? It's like the ordinance we're talking about with the discretion to the department heads gives the department heads the determination to make the first threshold decision, and then it's up to the enforcement officer. So it'd almost be like Nancy would have to say in its current condition, it's a health violation or a serious health condition. And then Joe would have to say, I agree with Nancy, it is. Or Joe would have to go out there and say, I don't know, Nancy, what do you think about this? Vice versa. And I think that's what you were talking about, Jason, is that Joe had the right to do that. And I hate using people, but Joe has the right to ask Nancy by our statute. By the other one we were discussing, it's almost, he would be compelled to have the department head make that determination.
I would have to say, from just on my opinion on this, the CEO being compelled to have another department essentially vet his determination of what the situation was. So it turns out that this is not a health issue. The police have no issue with it. The building department has no issue with it. Now what do we do? The other three departments that we're saying would have to say to me, okay, yes, we think it is. If it's not any of those things, and I can easily see that particular situation being none of those, well, then who's driving the bus?
Yeah, that's
So then
why
you
I
have
don't want to get very specific with shirts on trees.
Well, then you have a catch-all. The catch-all would be the enforcement officer determines the condition of the building, structure, or parcel that it poses a serious or immediate danger to the safety, health, or general welfare of the community, which is what we have.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, I mean, general
because
welfare of the community is pretty broad, but it does certainly cover something like that.
Well, it
I
does, right?
don't think what Joe described would even be caught in that definition. How is that collection of stuff around a property?
Really, I think that
anything
goes
other than an eyesore for the one neighbor?
really, I think that goes into that last one where we have the cars, boats, automobiles, furniture, appliances, that we can add a few more aspects into that of building materials, and equipment or something along those lines, into that definition. And like I said, into the exception that we carve out, not to exceed as may be reasonably related to the restore or restoration of equipment or property owned by the property owner. And that
Jason said you did a good job.
The only
I
thing,
said you said that we did a pretty good job, basically is what you're saying.
I do. I think you guys did a very good job. I think it's just fine tuning a couple of small things. And I think what we have there works pretty well.
Actually, one thing for me that I just kind of a personal philosophical question is, we have this general welfare. Okay, well, the idea of the one neighbor who's got this lovely piece of property overlooking this pile, well, the first thing I get is, I'm paying $14,000 a year in taxes. Now, why am I looking at that?
Yeah.
And that's why
That's question number one.
Yeah,
And that's why there's a time constraint on it.
General welfare, right? Like,
Yeah, I mean, so what do we mean by that then? I mean, everybody, they're entitled to enjoy their property. Why am I looking at that mess?
But that's not welfare.
Right. But that's why I think that vast definition exists. And that's also why there's a time exception on it. And that you can go, that gives you the ability to say, listen, if they're doing work on their house, we've given, by our ordinance, they can compile that there for up to 6 months. If this continues while they are doing that work, if it continues past that, please let us know and we'll take a look at it.
I don't know, my and I do agree with you, Jason. Some of those more general, the new definition, right, is specifically more general, right? And it accommodates. I personally just get very nervous around the second we list nouns. Let me not use the term specific anymore. Nouns, building materials, cars, RVs. If we're not completing in totality and we miss things, because the second you say something, it's got to be everything, right? And
Add a catch-all, or
but then why say anything anyways, right? Just add the catch-all. So that's my point. Like,
because
to me,
it gives specific examples. Just say the including but not limited to.
Yeah, maybe, but I've always viewed blight. Blight to me is the traditional definition of blight. It's a health concern, it's a fire hazard, or it's going to cause someone harm if they go near it, right? And it's, to me, planning and zoning, police, fire marshal, and health have it across the board, right? And I know, Joe, you're talking, as I agree with you, you're talking about, well, what if there's something that falls out of that? My God, that's got to be 99% of what blight is. It has to be. I'd be shocked if it wasn't. To me, we're just getting into the law of diminishing returns at this point. We're not going to be perfect at the end of this. It's not. No matter what we do, we will not be perfect. So I just personally, my personal feeling is I agree with you, actually, Jason, those generalized, specific definitions up front. I think the second we start using nouns, we're getting ourselves in a problem. And just use the catch-all, because 99% of what's going to be blight is going to be covered by 4 other departments. That's just my personal feeling.
Kev, the big, again, going back to my time on L&A, the big issue was too strong of a blight ordinance starts to make the town of Monroe, it turns into a giant planned unit development.
Yep.
That's why people live in condominium complexes. That's why they live in planned unit developments. This is not either of those. And the more you define blight, the more you're making the town hall the civil police power that.
And not only that,
in my personal
obligated.
opinion was not intended. to-
Obligated.
Correct, correct. So that's why we are here with, that's why we've been here for 10 years.
Yep.
And then if you want to take it deeper, it was, do we have the manpower? What budgetary requirements and constraints is it putting upon staff? Are we taking that individual or individuals away from other more egregious situations, priority, all the other stuff? And it was just like,
Yeah.
our hands up.
So is it safe to say then, or would it be possible? Would it be possible to use that language you talked about, which is per the other departments that are relevant, and then some of Jason's terminology around the general but specific, right? You slated one, Jason, that I think maybe was some tweak, and that could be it. Like that literally could be our blight definition, and then see how that works. Like no one is out to screw any citizens, right? Like it's all going to be in the execution of it. It always is. Always.
And it's really for the most egregious situations. That's what we're trying to cover here.
Yeah.
You know, perpetual,
Yeah.
most egregious situations and individual citizens, unfortunately, who are not looking to cooperate and come into compliance. That's what it comes down to.
But and I agree. And the second we say farm equipment, that then becomes an egregious, it can become an obligated, egregious thing. And that's not what we're trying to do. The second we say a shirt in a tree, that's now an obligated, egregious position. Because
It's a slippery slope, sure. Yeah.
So I don't know, is there a happy medium? Like, how do we get that drafted up so we can look at it? You don't want me writing legal language. I'm
Give
not.
me direction and I'll write it. That's why I'm happier. I'm much better sitting in this chair than I was sitting in your chair.
I know.
It's much easier for me.
John, Kevin, are you okay with basically giving Frank the directive of taking that Westport definition that he likes?
Yep.
Combining it with our our yellow highlighted things here, but with taking out the specifics. So things like that section D would be, it has material which is incapable of performing the function for which it is designed.
Right.
Take out the whole, including but not limited to.
Right.
And then with the carve out, notwithstanding the foregoing 6 months to the repair or restoration of equipment or property owned by the property owner or the tenant.
Yes, I would agree with that, because here's why. Here's the chess move. We're just three dudes in L&A, right? We have only so much opinion. I think we have done our piece, which was to draft an example blight ordinance up. We get that drafted. We could take one of two choices. We can either run that up to council, and that could be the sort of public hearing, or we can have another L&A meeting, give other people, public participation to talk about that. But 9 people are going to vote on this, not 3. Yeah. I think that gets us to where we need it. Smart. It doesn't obligate anybody to do crazy stuff. And I think the execution from the administrative perspective is well built. So let's just get that out there and see if that meets everybody's thoughts.
And I would say the general without specific of that would be, it has materials or objects which are incapable.
Yeah.
Well, now you guys are gonna have to send me emails.
Jason, could I ask you to just summarize that in an email? What you just said is perfect to me.
Yeah.
You are.
The other suggestion I might make is you might want to look at some of the things that we have, send it to building and health or other examples, and ask them if those facts, if they exist, would rise to the level of violations in our definition. You may want to do that. That's something that's kind of where we were. And then when we stopped to say, okay, if there was a missing wall, would that constitute blight in your opinion pursuant to this definition? That way you kind of know, you can run a hypothetical kind of by each of those departments to see how far your definition is going. It doesn't need to be limited. Does it do what you intend it to do? You may want to do that. I'm not saying you have to do it before.
I like that idea, but I would say that we do that after we have if we're going to have a public session, that we do that after we have our public session, and then we as a committee have a chance to take in that public comment and kind of get to our finalization rather than waste, I hate to say waste their time, but waste their time doing it now, then us changing everything and having to do it with them again.
Well,
As
I
I think their
disagree with that.
time is
I
valuable with
disagree with
that.
that very vehemently because
Okay,
you're gonna have a public, if I came to the public session, I would give you an example, then you may want to say, yes, that constitutes something that would be violative pursuant to what we have. You wouldn't know the answer to that.
but it
Someone
would give us
said,
a, it would
"Hi,
give us a
Mr.
chance
Mauer."
to get those we can say we can say that the purpose of this hearing is to exactly hear that. We need to take these comments to the town officials to get those answers. Because if they come with a hypothetical that we didn't specifically pose, we still wouldn't know the answer to that. Or
Yeah,
we
but
ask those members to be at that public hearing to have that discussion.
Well, but you could say, for example, John Q. Public, we've had these following examples and we vetted them with the official, not saying, no, we didn't do anything. I'm just gonna step out for a second. That was my daughter and now my wife. So I want to make sure everything's
Sure
okay.
thing.
Hello.
See the pecking order there. What do they call that when something is a marker for something? Is something bell? What is it like? Even though it's not a specific thing it's applied to, it's an example of it, and usually will be like a precedence.
It's like an indicator.
Like an indicator. The word I'm looking has bell in it. It's called something bell. It's a, oh my God, what is it? A slang term. I can't remember. Sorry. I'm just writing where we've got some operations crap going on at work and I'm trying to, we got this weird issue with a broadcast router and it's
A bellwether.
bellwether.
That's
Yes.
the word? You said
Bellwether. Yeah.
Well, that was an easy one. I thought you were looking harder than that.
I know. Well, simple.
Because you said bell was something like, okay, something bell. Right.
Yeah.
Is weather like, is it one word or what is it?
It's one word, bellwether, WETHER, is a leader or an indicator of trends.
No kidding. No kidding.
It's an old word.
Oh, boy. I'm assuming at some point we'll get to the conversation about the actual enforcement process.
Whatever you do for zoning, you do for this.
That's exactly what I'm.
Yes, it works. That's all set. We discussed that last time.
So
It's gonna be the same process.
So the 6-month requirement, how would you handle that for large development projects? I'm thinking about the one at the corner of Cutler's Farm and Purdy. I'm thinking about the one up on 25 for the senior housing. I'm thinking about Pondview.
well.
I'm thinking about all these projects where there's gonna be construction material sitting around waiting to be.
Now, that's a different situation, because here, one of the things I do like about this is that it does call for material not being used for its intended purpose. So obviously, the guy with a giant pile of tree trunks in the yard, clearly they can't be trees anymore. Somebody who's got a pile of 14-inch PVC conduit on a construction site where you can easily justify, yeah, we're using that in the drainage that goes over here. And we had to order it now because of the backlog of getting materials. Like, that's all pretty self-explanatory.
Right. And That's spot
It'd be
on,
pretty
and it
rare to
also goes
find-
back into
Yeah.
the discretion here of the blight enforcement officer of being able to say it is being used in its intended purposes and it is there for a specific purpose and it is being remediated in the time frame that we expect it to be remediated. Therefore, I don't think there should be any fees or penalty or
Right, well, they've asked for
infraction.
an extension on this because we're delayed because something else happened, now we're not gonna get it in for another.
I just want to make sure that we're cognizant of some of the development that's done in phases.
Yeah.
Like the corner of Cutler's and
Right.
Purdy, where they're gonna do 7 or 8 different buildings. I think 6 or 7 of them are already sold, so they'll put those 2 buildings up for those units. But the other units might be a year, 2 behind,
Right,
but there might be material on site for those buildings, whatever it may be, I don't know.
right.
That we're not looking at that site
Yeah.
as a possible violation of your
Yeah,
new
I think
rules.
that would be, I mean, from just from a practical standpoint, I mean, I could see how somebody could complain about that, but
As can I.
now we get about as far as my phone, and like, if I do.
Well, and Joe too, just from the building inspector, right? And the folks that are looking at the site.
Right.
Like that stuff's all under planning and zoning and the requirements that the engineer and the contractor bring to planning and zoning, stating that it will be their obligation to keep a site clean, right? Like if they have trucks coming in and out, they have to have the splash pad, there's all, like, they can't just have weird things lying around. Like that'll all be supervised through the building permit.
They can't have stuff there that has nothing to do with that job site.
Right,
You can't
right.
simply be bringing, equipment there that has nothing to do with what you're doing, because you need a
Yeah.
place to park your stuff.
Yeah. And I get Bill's point, right? Like if the contractor and the GC and building are working together, that it's sort of acted on there.
Right, it solves itself, yeah.
That I agree with you, Bill. Geez, how bad would that have to be if Blake got called on that one, right?
Yeah,
I just don't want to put ourselves in a box
Yeah.
that we don't want to be in and we're not intending to be in.
Yeah.
But as we're throwing out examples of things that we should be looking at, I also want to highlight examples of things that we shouldn't really be looking at all.
Well, that's a really great example. The way like Frank laid it out and Jason sort of summing it up is take that one, act it out, role play it. It's 6 months in, 2 buildings are up. There's going to be a year stall for whatever reason, but they've gotten through statutory requirements. They've gotten either that appeal's been done or that it's worked out in the building permit process. So someone makes a call and says they've got a tractor or an excavator that's been on the property, just sitting there rusting away, and there's oil dripping or something, right? That's going to come into the building side, right? Like that should, no matter what, it should never be blight. And our, as you said, Bill, and I know where you're going with this, that's why I don't want to be that specific, where all of a sudden now, because of the definition, we've got someone like Joe having to go because he's obligated and compelled to go review that. He should just be able to go to whoever the building inspector is and say, hey, you probably, I got this call, but really it's your call. There could be a violation on the building permit and what they said they would leave there and when they said they would be constructing things.
So what do you know about it? If the guy's gonna start back up in 2 months, okay, fine, problem solved. So we just,
Exactly.
Karuba's building took 5 years.
exactly, right. Was there any blight out there? No,
No.
Yeah.
it's just slow.
So what's next steps? I mean, I'm just getting popped here. So we've been at it for about an hour and 20 minutes tonight. I think it's been a good meeting. Are we at the point where we can summarize some of this in email through Jason? Get it.
I
over-
already sent it.
Thank you. So then I think Frank, just let us know when you can draft up a new one. I forgive me if I'm overstating here or above my skis on what you now can do. But if you can get a document back to us or someone, we'll just have another meeting. I think we should probably have another meeting and review that, right? Maybe use the next L&A meeting that we normally have before a council meeting, just to review what Frank came up with, whenever that is. And then if we like it, we then have a public participation L&A meeting shortly afterwards. Whatever comes out of that, we then bring that to council.
Based off of Frank's recommendation, do we want to, whether it is our next regular public meeting after a regular meeting after we get this back from Frank, or whether we do another special meeting. Do we want to have a meeting where we invite those department heads as well as part of this review to make sure what we think is covered would be covered? And I kind of combine those two procedures. And then we do the public meeting right after that, kind of have our next meeting be review this and talk to department heads, and then a public meeting.
I can take, I mean, just to save the department heads the burden of coming to this meeting, although they probably would love to see you guys. I can certainly take the final draft and any suggestions and discuss specifics with the department heads, run it through them, and then report back so that I'm the only one.
That's the best.
That's the best way. I like that.
I
Yep.
agree. Yeah.
And then I can
All right.
say, here are the concerns, comments, and then.
The only thing I will say is, why don't we, after we receive all that back, why don't we have one meeting where we won't have public input? Just so that the three of us agree to it, and then the next one will have public input after it's solidified.
Yeah, I think we're all in agreement with that.
All right, gents, I do have, thank you so much. I actually have to bolt.
No problem.
I had to
Yeah,
vote out.
but, yeah, we'll schedule the next one. Thank you.
Be well, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rick, for the technology.
Thank you.
7:22.